When aliens begged for aid, Deathworlders arrived with a storm of vengeance. Part 2. What Humans Are. The UES Harbinger was not a pretty ship. It was not built to be. It was long and dark, and covered in thick armor plating that had been scorched and re-welded so many times in its service life that the hull looked like a patchwork of old scars. Inside it smelled like recycled air, machine oil, and whatever was cooking in the galley on any given day. It was loud with the hum of its engines and the constant movement of its crew. It was, in short, exactly the kind of ship that got things done. Commander Kyle Wren stood in the main briefing room and looked at the faces of his crew. There were 340 people on the Harbinger. They were pilots, marines, engineers, doctors, and a handful of specialists pulled from various branches of the United Earth Fleet. Kyle was a tall man, lean and angular, with dark eyes that missed very little. He had commanded ships for 14 years, and had never once asked his crew to do something he would not do himself. They knew that about him. It was why they trusted him. He told them plainly what they were going into. He did not dress it up. He told them about the Vihari, the peaceful civilization that was being destroyed. He told them about the Dreth Dominion, the conquering empire that had wiped out 14 species before them. He told them that the first response fleet was 3 ships, and that the Dreth likely had far more than 3 ships in the target system. He told them that they did not have complete intelligence on the enemy's capabilities, and that there would be things they encountered out there that no human had ever seen before. Then he paused and said, "I am not going to tell you this will be easy, but I will tell you this. We are going because something needs help, and we are the ones close enough to give it. That is the whole reason." Nobody in the room said a word against it. A few people nodded. One engineer in the back row started checking his tablet for power system diagnostics before the briefing was even finished. That was the Harbinger. Sergeant Dana Ortiz was one of the senior Marines aboard. She was compact and fast, with short dark hair and forearms that looked like they had been built by someone who took the job seriously. She had served in the Titan suppression campaigns, a series of brutal close-quarters engagements in the low-gravity tunnels of Saturn's largest moon, where the fighting had been ugly and personal, and nothing like the clean simulations at the Academy. She had come back from Titan with 3 commendations and a scar along her jaw that she never bothered explaining. She did not talk much about the past. She focused on what was in front of her. She spent the first week of the journey running her squad through drills. Combat in zero gravity. Combat in alien architecture, using rough simulations built from what little the xenolinguistics team knew about Dreth ship design. Breach and clear procedures for corridors of unknown width. Emergency suit repair. She drilled them hard because she knew that the body fell back on what it had practiced when the mind went blank with fear. And she wanted her people's bodies to know exactly what to do. Among her squad was Cody Hale, a young Marine on his first deep space deployment. He was 23, from a small town in Oregon, and had an honest face that made him look younger than he was. He was good, strong, quick, attentive, willing to work, but he had not yet seen real combat, and Dana could see the particular kind of tightness around his eyes that came from trying very hard not to look worried. She did not go easy on him because of it. She pushed him the same as everyone else, because going easy on someone before a fight was not kindness. It was a different kind of cruelty. Dr. Ethan Marsh traveled aboard the Harbinger as the mission's cultural and linguistic specialist. He was not a soldier and made no pretense of being one. He kept to the research section of the ship, surrounded by screens and data drives and his paper notebooks, working to refine his understanding of the Vihari language so that when, not if, he insisted on saying when, they made contact, communication would be possible. He had managed to establish a long-range communication thread with what appeared to be a surviving Vihari elder. The signal was weak and intermittent, and the translation was rough, but it was real. The elder called itself Sovereign. though Ethan was careful to note that Vahari names carried gender markers that did not map cleanly onto human equivalents. He settled on referring to Sovereign simply as the Elder. The conversations were strange and slow, and full of gaps. Sovereign was clearly frightened, not just of the Dreth, but of the humans who had answered the call. The Elder asked, in fragmented translated phrases, what kind of beings the humans were, whether they were strong, whether they were many, whether they knew how to fight. Ethan tried to explain. He told Sovereign that humans came from a very difficult planet, that their world had never been safe, not even at the beginning, that Earth had volcanoes and earthquakes and wild weather and animals that could kill a person in 100 different ways, that the humans had survived all of it for hundreds of thousands of years without ever finding a comfortable, easy version of existence, that the whole history of humanity was a story of a species that refused to stop, even when everything around it said stop. Sovereign was quiet for a long time after that translation went through. Then the Elder asked one more question. It came through the translator haltingly, but its meaning was clear. Are they coming to fight, or are they coming to save us? Ethan thought about that for a moment. Then he typed his response carefully and sent it across the dark. He wrote, both. Meanwhile, far across the Kepler expanse, in the Dreth Dominion's mobile command center, a vast and angular vessel built without curves, because the Dreth found curves unnecessary. High Commander Veilkoff received his first intelligence report about the responding force. His analysts had flagged the 3 human ships almost as an afterthought, buried in a longer report about resource extraction on the second Vahari moon. One of the junior analysts had appended a brief note about humanity. Class 3 minor species, barely interstellar, no confirmed military engagements of scale, likely motivated by ideology rather than strategy, not considered a significant threat. Veilkoff read the note. He set the report aside. He did not send reinforcements to the Vahari system. He did not alert his forward fleet commanders. He did not even ask for a follow-up assessment. He had crushed Class 3 species before. Twice. Both times it had been over in days. He turned his attention back to the Vahari extraction schedule. Back on the Harbinger, Kyle Wren stood at the forward observation window and looked at the stars ahead. The ship was 11 days out from the Vahari system. He had read everything Ethan had put together about the Dreth, their tactics, their fleet formations, their history of conquest. He had read it twice and made notes. The Dreth fought in organized lines, maintaining formation discipline and using numerical superiority to overwhelm opposition. They relied on the shock of first contact to break the enemy's will. They had never encountered a species that did not break. Kyle folded his notes and put them in his jacket pocket. He found her in the training bay, still running drills, even though it was past midnight ship time. She looked up when he came in, and her squad snapped to attention. He told them at ease. He looked at Dana and said, "They are going to expect us to be afraid." Dana looked back at him steadily. "That is going to be a problem for them," she said. Kyle almost smiled. He nodded once and walked back out. The Harbinger kept moving through the dark. 3 ships. 340 people on this one alone. A species that had been forged in fire and pressure, and 10,000 years of refusing to quit, now flying towards something that had never met anything quite like them. The Dreth had no idea what was coming. H1. When aliens begged for aid, Deathworlders arrived with a storm of vengeance. H2. Part 3. First contact with the Dreth. The Vahari system came into view slowly, the way bad news always does, piece by piece, until the full picture was impossible to look away from. The 3 Earth ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, at the outer edge of the system, well beyond sensor range of the Dreth fleet, using a cold entry approach that Kyle Ren had drilled his navigation team on for the last 3 days of the journey. They came in quiet, with minimal power output, drifting on calculated trajectories, while every scanner on the Harbinger worked to build a picture of what lay ahead. What came back on the screens was grim. The Vihari system had 3 moons with known habitation. Not in the way that things burn when there is an accident or a natural disaster. They were burning in the way that things burn when someone has decided they should burn. The fires were structured, deliberate, the kind of destruction that takes planning and effort and a complete absence of hesitation. The primary world, the largest and most populated of the 3 moons, orbiting a great amber gas giant, was still intact, but it was surrounded. 40 Dreth warships formed a loose shell around it, cutting off any escape. They were dark, angular vessels, built in shapes that suggested no concern whatsoever for anything except function. They had no lights except the dull red glow of their engine exhaust. They looked from a distance like the teeth of something very large and very patient. Kyle stood at the center of the Harbinger's bridge and looked at the display for a long moment without speaking. His navigation officer, a quiet young man named Sean Adler, sat very still at his console. The rest of the bridge crew kept their eyes on their screens, doing their jobs, keeping their hands steady. Kyle said, "Give me a full breakdown of their formation. I want firing arcs, movement patterns, and any gaps in the net." He had it within 4 minutes. The Dreth formation was standard for a blockade, evenly spaced, overlapping coverage, with a heavier concentration of ships on the sunward side where any escape attempt would most likely originate. It was organized and professional. It was also, Kyle noted, built for dealing with a single type of opposition, a larger force trying to break through from outside, or a smaller force trying to escape from inside. It was not built for 3 ships that had no intention of doing either of those things. He called a brief meeting with his senior staff and the commanders of the other 2 ships on a secure channel. He laid out his plan in plain language. They would not try to break the blockade head-on. They would go through it from an angle, fast and hard, targeting the command and control vessels first to disrupt the Dreth's ability to coordinate. They would use the Caldwell and the Ironjaw to draw fire, while the Harbinger got close enough to engage at short range, where human targeting systems, built for the kind of chaotic close-quarters fighting that Earth's military history was full of, had a significant edge over Dreth equipment designed for long-range engagements. Nobody objected. The other 2 commanders confirmed their understanding. The plan was set. Then Kyle called Paige Donovan, his communications officer, and told her to open a channel to the Dreth fleet on a broad frequency. The response came back within 60 seconds. It was translated by the onboard system in a flat, even voice that did nothing to soften the content. The Dreth commander on the other end identified himself by rank only, no name, just a title, and informed the 3 human ships that they had entered Dominion-claimed space. They were ordered to cut power and prepare for boarding and cataloging as property of the Dreth Dominion. Resistance would be processed as destruction. There was no offer of negotiation. There was no curiosity about who these ships were or where they had come from. There was just the assumption that compliance would follow, the way compliance always followed. Kyle listened to the whole transmission. Then he turned to Paige and said, "Tell them no." Paige looked at him. He nodded. She opened the channel and said, in a clear and steady voice, "No." There was a pause on the other end. Then the Dreth channel cut. The 40 Dreth warships began to move. What followed was not a battle by any standard the Dreth had known in 400 years of conquest. It did not go the way their tactical systems predicted. It did not go the way their commanders expected. It did not, in fact, go any way at all that the Dreth had encountered before, because the Dreth had never fought humans. The 3 Earth ships did not form a line, They did not pick a point and push. They came apart from each other and moved in 3 different directions at once, fast and aggressive. And every time a Dreth ship tried to bring its weapons to bear on one of them, there was already another one doing something unexpected somewhere else. The Harbinger cut under a Dreth cruiser at a distance that the Dreth ship's crew almost certainly considered suicidal, fired upward into the vessel's underside at point-blank range, and was moving again before the explosion finished. Sean Adler flew like the ship was part of his body. He had grown up racing atmospheric craft over the Nevada desert, had been flying since he was 14, and he had a feel for movement and space that was not something that could be taught. He pushed the Harbinger through gaps that should not have been possible for a ship its size, and he did it smoothly, without panic, with the slightly detached focus of someone who was very much in their element. In the first hour, the Earth fleet destroyed 11 Dreth warships. 11 ships in 1 hour. The Dreth had never lost 11 ships to any enemy in any single engagement in their recorded history. Their standard tactical framework had no response protocol for this. Their formation broke apart as individual commanders began making independent decisions, which was exactly what Kyle had wanted, because a disorganized enemy was an enemy you could pick apart piece by piece. Dana Ortiz led her boarding team out of the Harbinger in the second hour. The breach was made through the hull of a Dreth command cruiser that had been crippled by the Caldwell's railgun batteries. The approach was magnetic. Her team in full combat suits, crossing open space on boot-mounted anchors and hand-over-hand lines, attaching breach charges to the cruiser's underbelly, while Dreth point defense fires sparked off their armor. 2 of her people took hits that dented their suits. They kept moving. When the charges blew and the team went through the hull, the Dreth crew inside stopped. Not because they were cowardly. They stopped because they had never seen anything board a ship this way. Nobody boarded ships this way. It was not rational. It was the kind of thing a creature did when it had grown up on a planet where safe was a story you told children, not a condition you expected to actually live in. Dana did not give them time to recover from the surprise. The boarding action lasted 22 minutes. The cruiser was secured. Far across the system, in his command vessel orbiting a distant moon, High Commander Vale Koth was receiving reports in real time. He read each one carefully. He read them again. Then he pulled up the intelligence file on humanity. The full file, not the summary note his analyst had flagged. He read about Earth. He read about its tectonic activity, its atmospheric extremes, its biological history of mass extinctions, its megafauna, its pathogens, its geological violence. He read about the long, brutal history of the humans themselves, the wars they had fought against each other, the plagues they had survived, the famines and droughts and disasters that had killed millions of them across the centuries, and how they had kept going through all of it, kept rebuilding, kept fighting, never once as a species simply stopping. His analyst had labeled them Class 3. He stared at the screen for a very long time. Then he opened a command channel to his nearest reserve fleet. He requested 100 more ships. He told himself that 100 more ships would be more than enough. He was not sure he believed it. Back on the Harbinger, Kyle Wren stood at the display and watched the numbers. 11 ships destroyed. 14 more damaged and pulling back. 2 Dreth vessels had attempted to break formation and run. The first time in recorded history a Dreth ship had retreated from anything. His own fleet had taken damage. The Iron Jaw had lost its forward gun array. The Caldwell had a hull breach in its secondary section that the repair crews were already sealing. Nobody on the Earth side had died yet. He thought about the Vihari down on that moon, looking up at a sky that had been full of enemies for weeks. He thought about the signal that Aaron Cole had pulled out of the dark on a quiet Tuesday morning. Then he went back to work. There were 27 Dreth ships still in the area. and humanity was just getting started. When aliens begged for aid, Deathworlders arrived with a storm of vengeance. Part 4. The storm deepens. Earth did not send 3 ships and then wait to see what happened. That was not how Earth worked. Within 6 days of the first engagement report reaching the Global Defense Council, Director Laura Voss had the full authorization she needed. The second and third rapid response fleets were activated. 214 vessels in total, ranging from heavy carriers to fast escort destroyers, and they began the journey toward the Kepler expanse in 2 waves. Ground forces were assembled under the command of General Mara Quinn, a tall, methodical officer with close-cut hair and the unhurried manner of someone who planned carefully and then moved fast. She had fought in 4 separate colonial campaigns and was known for one particular quality above all others. She did not leave a job half done. While the reinforcements were still in transit, the 3-ship First Response Fleet continued to hold the Vihari system against the Dreth forces that remained. It was hard work. The Dreth reinforcements that Vale Koth had requested began arriving in pieces, not all at once, but in groups of 10 and 15, appearing at the system's edge and moving to rejoin the shattered blockade. Each time a new group arrived, Kyle Ren had to adjust. He could not fight 100 ships with 3. He did not try. He used speed and precision to keep the Dreth off balance, targeting their command ships first to slow their coordination, then pulling back when the numbers got too heavy, then coming in again from a different angle. It was exhausting, grinding work, and the cost was real. Cody Hale was wounded on the surface of the primary Vihari moon during the 4th day of ground operations. A small Dreth garrison had been established on the moon's northern continent, holding a cluster of Vihari settlements under occupation. Dana Ortiz had led her team down in a drop insertion, a fast descent in armored capsules, hitting the surface at speed and moving immediately. The fighting in the settlement was close and brutal. The Dreth soldiers were larger than humans and heavily armored, and they did not break easily. They fought in disciplined groups, covering each other, falling back in order rather than panicking. Cody was moving through a narrow alley between 2 low stone buildings when a Dreth soldier came around the corner at full speed. There was no time for anything clean. The collision was physical and violent, and ended with Cody on the ground with a fractured left leg and a cracked rib, and the Dreth soldier down beside him, because Dana had put 2 shots through its armor from 12 meters away without breaking stride. She reached Cody in seconds. He was pale and breathing fast, but conscious. She told him to stay still. He told her he was fine. She told him he was not fine, and that being not fine was acceptable, and that the medic was 30 seconds behind her. He was evacuated to the Harbinger's medical bay, and spent the next 4 days off the field. He hated every hour of it. Dana lost 2 people in the same operation. Lance Corporal Ray Sutton and Specialist Gwen Park were killed by a coordinated Dreth counterattack in the settlement's central square, during the final push to clear the garrison. They died doing exactly what they had trained to do, moving forward when everything said stop. Dana wrote their names on the inside cover of her field notebook that night, the way she had written other names in other notebooks before them. She did not grieve loudly. She went back to work the next morning. Kyle Ren made the hardest decision of his career on the 6th day. The Dreth had positioned a new formation of 40 ships in a tight cluster around the second inhabited moon, the one that was still partially burning, but still had a population of several 100,000 Vihari alive in its deeper shelter systems. The cluster was designed as bait. If the Earth fleet engaged it, the Dreth had a flanking force of 30 ships positioned to come in from the outer system and catch the Harbinger and its companions between 2 groups of enemy vessels. Kyle saw the trap. He acknowledged that he saw it, and then he made his call. He took the Caldwell, the second of the 3 Earth ships, and sent her straight into the flanking force at full speed. running interference, while the Harbinger and the Ironjaw dismantled the 40-ship cluster. The Caldwell's commander, a steady officer named Ray Garland, understood exactly what he was being asked to do. He confirmed the order and took his ship in. The Caldwell was destroyed 40 minutes later. She took 11 Dreth ships with her before she went. Her crew of 300 did not survive. Kyle stood at the Harbinger's bridge display and watched it happen. He did not look away. He would never look away from a decision he had made. When it was over, he was quiet for a very long time. Sean Adler watched him from the navigation console and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The second moon's population was saved. Kyle carried those 300 names with him from that day forward, the same way Dana carried hers. On the 8th day, Dr. Ethan Marsh made a discovery. He had been working continuously with Sovereign, and through the Elder, he had gained access to decades of Vihari observations of the Dreth Dominion. Records that the Vihari had kept carefully and quietly while watching their neighbors fall one by one. What the records showed was something that the Dreth's own intelligence services would not have wanted known. The Dominion was cracking from the inside. Many of the species the Dreth had conquered over the centuries had not been destroyed. They had been absorbed, pressed into service as labor forces, technical workers, and support personnel. Some of them had served the Dominion for generations and had long since stopped hoping for anything different. But others, particularly among the more recently conquered, were still holding something underneath, a quiet, banked anger that had never been entirely put out. Ethan brought this to Fleet Admiral Nathan Drake, who had arrived in the system aboard his command vessel as part of the Second Wave Fleet. Nathan read the report, standing up. He had a habit of doing that when he was thinking hard, standing at his desk rather than sitting, as though the extra inch of height gave him a better view of the problem. He authorized covert contact operations immediately. Small teams of Earth specialists began reaching out through channels that the Dreth monitoring systems were not designed to detect, using Vihari communication relays as intermediaries, speaking carefully, offering nothing that could be used as evidence, just making a simple and factual point to anyone inside the Dominion who was willing to listen. The tide was turning. The Dreth Dominion was losing. The door was open. The response, when it began to come in, was slow. And then it was not slow at all. Species that had bent their heads for generations began to straighten. Vale Koth, watching his tactical situation deteriorate in ways he could not fully explain and could not fully contain, made his final gamble. He assembled a strike force of 22 of the Dominion's fastest stealth ships, and loaded one of them with a planet cracker missile, a weapon that the Dreth had used 11 times in their history of conquest to end wars immediately by making the cost of resistance total and permanent. He aimed it at Earth. If humanity had nothing to come home to, humanity would stop fighting. The strike force departed in silence, moving on a long, curved approach that was designed to avoid every known human detection system. It reached the edge of the Sol system 17 days later. Earth's early warning grid detected it in 11 minutes. The grid was not something any other species in the known galaxy had built, because building it required a particular kind of thinking. The kind of thinking that comes from a species that has spent its entire history expecting danger and preparing for it anyway. It was vast, layered, redundant, and had been updated continuously for 200 years by people who understood that the absence of a visible threat was not the same thing as safety. Earth's home defense fleet scrambled. Every single Dreth stealth ship was identified, tracked, and destroyed before the planet cracker could fire. The whole engagement lasted less than 2 hours. Earth did not divert a single vessel from the Kepler expanse to handle it. The home defense forces were already there, as they always were, because Nathan Drake had never once in his career believed that leaving home unguarded was acceptable. When the battle report reached Veilkoth, he read it 3 times. He sat in his command chair for a very long time. Outside his viewport, the stars were the same as they had always been. But something had changed. He could feel it in the way you feel a shift in pressure before a storm, not seeing it yet, but knowing it is there, knowing it is close, knowing that when it arrives, it will not be small. He opened a channel to his remaining fleet commanders. He told them to consolidate, to hold position, to prepare for a defense of Dominion space. He did not tell them he was afraid, but somewhere under the calm of his command voice, under the discipline of 40 years of warfare and conquest, something very much like fear had taken root. Because the humans had not flinched. They had absorbed everything he sent and kept coming. They had bled and kept coming. He had tried to reach their home, and they had stopped him without even slowing down. He had run out of moves that he knew would work, and the humans were still coming. When aliens begged for aid, Deathworlders arrived with a storm of vengeance. Part 5, The Reckoning. The Dreth home system was called Varric Sol in translated Dominion records, and it sat at the center of the Empire like a heart. Every supply line, every command chain, every reinforcement route led back to it eventually. Take Varric Sol, and the Dominion did not fall overnight, but it lost the ability to think of itself as unbeatable. And an empire that no longer believes it cannot be beaten has already begun to end. Nathan Drake understood this. He had understood it from the moment Ethan's intelligence about the Dominion's internal fractures had come through. He did not rush. He spent 3 weeks consolidating the liberation of the Vahari system, making sure that the surviving Vahari population had food, medical support, and enough defensive coverage that no opportunistic Dreth force could come back and undo what had been done. He had not come this far to win a battle and lose the larger picture. When the Coalition fleet, Earth vessels combined now with ships from 4 formerly subjugated species who had risen against the Dominion at Earth's signal, finally moved toward Varric Sol, it was a force of nearly 300 ships. It was also something that the galaxy had not seen before. A multi-species fleet fighting together not because they had been ordered to by a conquering power, but because they had chosen to. Ethan Marsh stood at the observation window of the Harbinger and watched the fleet move, and felt something he could not quite name. He had spent his career studying languages and cultures, trying to find the places where different kinds of minds could touch each other and understand. He thought that what he was looking at now was one of those places. The battle for Varric Sol lasted 3 days. It was the largest engagement the fleet had fought, and it was brutal in every sense. The Dreth defending their home system fought harder than they had fought anywhere else, because home is always worth more than territory. And even an empire built on cruelty still has things inside it that its people value. They threw everything they had at the Coalition fleet. They were organized, determined, and willing to absorb terrible losses. But the Coalition was more than willing to match them. On the second day, General Mara Quinn led the ground assault on the fortified continent where the Dominion's central command structure was housed. She went in through the southern approach, using 3 divisions of ground forces in a coordinated push that was timed to coincide with an orbital bombardment that suppressed Dreth air defenses for a window of exactly 19 minutes. She had planned the timing down to the minute and rehearsed it 4 times in simulation. When it happened live, it ran within 40 seconds of the plan. She moved through the forward command posts on foot, staying near the action, watching the way the battle was developing and adjusting where she needed to. She was not reckless. She did not take unnecessary risks. But she believed that a general who led from the back while the people under her command bled at the front had lost something important, and she was not willing to lose it. Dana Ortiz was in the fight for the Central Citadel, the massive fortified building at the heart of the Dominion's command complex, deep behind the first lines of Dreth defense. She had a broken right arm, wrapped and splinted, because a Dreth soldier had driven a reinforced door into her during a breach operation the previous day. The ship's doctor had told her she needed to go back to the fleet and get the arm properly set. She had thanked him politely and gone back out. Her squad moved through the lower levels of the Citadel in tight formation, breaching room by room. The Dreth defenders inside were well-trained and not panicking. They fought in coordinated pairs, covering angles, using the architecture of the building to slow the advance. The fighting was close, loud, and constant. Cody Hale was part of the unit moving up the building's right flank. He had been cleared for light duty by the medical team. His leg was healed enough to carry weight, though it still ached when he pushed too hard. He pushed too hard anyway. He moved through the building's upper corridors with his rifle up and his breathing controlled, the way Dana had drilled him, one foot after the other, every room cleared before moving to the next. He was 23 years old, and he had seen more in the last 3 weeks than most soldiers saw in a career. He was not the same person who had boarded the Harbinger back at Earth, with bright nervous eyes and too much uncertainty. He had been worn down to something harder and simpler. He still had the honest face, but the tightness around his eyes was gone, replaced by a steadiness that only comes from having passed through something difficult and come out the other side. His unit reached the central command level first. They found Veilkoth in the main operations room, standing in the middle of the floor. The room was still running, screens still lit, data still flowing, but most of his staff had fled or been captured in the lower levels. He stood alone among the equipment of his empire, and he was very still. He had clearly made a decision not to run and not to fight, and the dignity of that stillness was the one thing about him that Cody would remember clearly for the rest of his life. Veilkoth was secured and brought under guard. Kyle Ren arrived on the surface 4 hours later and met with the High Commander in a plain room that had been cleared for the purpose. There was a table, 2 chairs, a translator unit between them, guards at the door. Veilkoth looked at Kyle across the table and said nothing for a long time. His species had no clear facial expressions that a human could read, but there was something in the set of his posture, a weight in it, that Kyle recognized. It was the look of something that had believed itself permanent, facing the evidence that it was not. Then Veilkoth spoke. The translator rendered it calmly. He said that he did not understand the humans, that no species in the Dominion's 400 years of expansion had fought the way humans fought, that no species had bled the way humans bled and kept going, that no species had reached across impossible distances to defend a people they had never met and had nothing to gain from saving. He said it without anger. He said it the way a person says something they have been thinking about for a long time and have finally decided to say out loud. Then he asked, "What are you?" Not because he was searching for an answer. The answer had been in him the whole time, simple and plain, but because he wanted to say it right. He looked at Veilkoth and said, "We are the ones who answered." Veilkoth was held in custody and later handed over to the newly forming Interspecies Council that rose in the Dominion's wake, made up of freed species, Vahari representatives, and human delegates, working together to decide what came next. What came next was slow and complicated and imperfect, the way rebuilding always is. The Dreth Dominion did not disappear overnight. Some of its outer fleets continued operating for months before being cornered and contained. Some of the political structures it had built took years to dismantle. There were disputes and setbacks and difficult negotiations, the kind that do not end with anyone entirely happy. But the center was broken. The systems it had held by force were free. Laura Voss was appointed the first human ambassador to the new interspecies coalition. She accepted the role the way she accepted every difficult job, without ceremony, with her eyes on the work that needed doing. On the Vaheri moon, in the weeks after the battle ended, the surviving population came back to the surface slowly, carefully, the way people come back to a place after a disaster. Not all at once, but piece by piece, testing the ground, making sure it holds. The burned land was still raw. Many of the settlements would need years to rebuild. The losses were enormous and would not be undone. Sova Rin stood in an open field, on the edge of what had once been a gathering place, and watched as a team of human engineers from the Harbinger worked alongside Vaheri survivors to clear debris and begin the first structural repairs. The engineers were noisy and cheerful, and occasionally broke into arguments about the best way to do things, which were resolved quickly and without lasting hard feelings. And then they went back to work. They had been at it since before dawn. Ethan stood beside Sovereign in the quiet of the early morning. The sky above was pale, and the air was cool, and somewhere in the distance, the engineers were laughing about something. After a long time, Sovereign rested a hand, four-fingered, light as leaves, on Ethan's arm. The elder said something softly in Vahari, and the small translator at Ethan's collar rendered it in a voice just above a whisper. We called into the dark. We did not know what light would come. Ethan stood with that for a moment. Then he nodded, very gently, and said nothing, because there was nothing he needed to add. Back aboard the relay station Iron Veil, Aaron Cole sat in the same chair where this had all begun. The Kepler expanse was quiet now. The signals coming in were routine, trade routes, survey data, the ordinary noise of inhabited space going about its business. He listened to it the way he always had, with the patient attention of someone trained to notice the thing that did not belong. He had already filed a standing order, cleared through the chain of command and approved by Fleet Admiral Drake himself, that formalized what had always been understood to be true but had never been written down. Any distress signal received by any Earth vessel, from any species, anywhere in accessible space, was to be treated as a priority response. No exceptions. No waiting for strategic assessment. No debate about whether the cost was worth it. Something calls, you answer. That was the whole policy. Aaron leaned back and looked out at the stars. They were the same as they had always been, cold and countless and completely indifferent to the small warm things that moved between them. But the small warm things were still moving, still listening, still ready to go when something in the dark sent out a signal made of numbers and fear, and the desperate hope that someone somewhere might be the kind of creature that would come. Humanity was that kind of creature. It always had been. H1. When aliens begged for aid, Deathworlders arrived with a storm of vengeance. H2. Part 1. A Cry from the Stars. P. The relay station Iron Veil floated in the dark between star systems, like a forgotten candle. It was not a glamorous posting. It was not the kind of place that showed up in recruitment posters or history books. It was a metal box full of antennas, old coffee, and people who had learned to be patient. Lieutenant Commander Aaron Cole had been stationed there for 11 months. He had grown used to the silence. So when the signal came, he noticed it immediately. It arrived in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, ship time. Aaron was sitting at his console with a half-eaten sandwich beside him, running routine checks on the outer range receivers. The signal was faint, broken, and unlike anything in the station's database. It was not a human signal. It was not any known alien signal either. But it had a structure to it, a pattern of prime numbers repeating in a sequence, climbing and falling, like something was screaming in a language made of mathematics. Aaron sat up straight and set down the sandwich. He ran the signal through every filter the station had. He boosted the gain. He recorded it 3 times to make sure he was not seeing a glitch in the system. Then he sat back and looked at what he had. The pattern was clear. Something out there was trying to communicate. Something out there was afraid. He sent the recording to Earth within the hour, flagged as Priority 1. It reached the Global Defense Council in New Denver 2 days later, after bouncing through 3 relay points and being reviewed by a signals team that had no idea what to make of it. The council convened in a long, low room with tall windows that looked out over the Rocky Mountain foothills. Director Laura Voss sat at the head of the table. She was a small woman with short gray hair and the kind of steady eyes that had looked at a great many bad situations without blinking. She had spent 30 years in planetary defense strategy and had overseen the Mars colonial crisis, the Europa deep water incident, and 2 border disputes with the Cathani Trade Collective. She had seen hard things. She listened to the signal and said nothing for a full minute. Beside her, Dr. Ethan Marsh, a xenolinguist with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers, was already scribbling notes on a paper pad. He preferred paper. He always said that screens were too easy to change. Paper forced you to commit to your thoughts. He looked up after a while and said, "It is a distress signal. The mathematical structure is consistent across all 3 recordings. Whoever sent this was trying to be understood by anyone who might receive it, regardless of what language they speak. They used primes because primes are universal. They used repetition because they wanted to make sure it got through." Laura asked him if he could tell what was happening to them. Ethan nodded slowly. He explained that certain elements of the signal structure, the rhythm, the urgency of the repetition, the way the sequence broke off and restarted, suggested extreme danger. Something was not just wrong, something was ending. Laura asked him to find out more. It took Ethan 3 weeks of work, running the signal against every linguistic and mathematical framework the Council's research division had access to, before he was able to decode a secondary layer buried inside the prime number pulse. What he found was not a detailed message. It was more like an impression, a set of emotional and symbolic markers that pointed to a few very clear things: a people, a world, fire, something coming, and a single repeated idea that translated roughly as, "Please." He brought the results to Laura in person and put them on her desk without a word. She read them. Then she read them again. Then she asked him to sit down and tell her everything. The species was called the Vihari. Ethan had cross-referenced the signal's origin point with long-range astronomical surveys and found a star system past the Kepler expanse, a region of space that human ships had mapped but never visited in any serious capacity. The Vihari inhabited 3 moons orbiting a gas giant in that system. By everything the signal suggested, they were not a militarized civilization. They were old, peaceful, and sophisticated in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or war. They had reached the stars in a quiet way, without conquest, building relationships with neighboring systems, through trade and culture. They had lived that way for centuries, and now something was killing them. The force responsible was identified in a later stage of Ethan's decoding work. He called them the Dreth Dominion. That was not their own name for themselves. It was a translation of a symbol in the signal that Ethan interpreted as referring to a controlling power, a conquering empire that had been moving through that region of space for generations. The Vihari signal contained fragments of information about the Dreth that were devastating in their simplicity. They were large. They were organized. They did not negotiate. 14 species had already been destroyed or enslaved by them across 6 star systems. The Vihari had watched them coming for years and had no way to stop them and nowhere to go. So they had done the only thing they could think of. They had sent a signal out into the dark and hoped that someone, somewhere, was listening. Laura took all of this to Fleet Admiral Nathan Drake. Nathan was a broad man with short silver hair and a face that looked carved rather than grown. He had commanded Earth fleets in 3 conflicts, and was known among his officers for 2 things. He never raised his voice, and he never changed his mind once he had made a decision. He read Ethan's full report in one sitting, and then asked Laura 2 questions. First, how long would it take to get ships to the Vihari system? Second, what was the minimum force that could make a meaningful difference? Laura told him both answers. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window behind his desk, New Denver was bright and ordinary in the afternoon sun. People were walking. Cars were moving. The world was going about its business the way it always did, not knowing that somewhere very far away, something gentle and old was being burned out of existence. Nathan looked at Laura and said, "We are going." There was a council meeting that afternoon. Several voices argued against it. Too far, too unknown, too expensive. A species humanity had never met, in a region of space humanity had barely mapped, being attacked by a force humanity knew nothing about. The risks were enormous. The strategic value was unclear. The likelihood of success was impossible to calculate. Nathan let them talk. He sat at the end of the table and listened to all of it. When they were done, he folded his hands and said in the same quiet voice he always used, "I have heard the arguments. We are still going. Because if we do not go, something innocent dies alone in the dark. And we had the ability to stop it, and chose not to. That is not what we are." Nobody argued after that. The order went out that evening. 3 warships would be prepared and dispatched as the first response force. Aaron Cole, who had intercepted the signal in the first place, received a new assignment 2 days later. He would be transferring from Iron Veil to the UES Harbinger, the lead vessel of the response fleet. He read the transfer order in the same chair where he had heard the signal for the first time. He looked out at the dark for a long moment. Then he picked up what remained of his old cold coffee, drank it, and started packing. The stars were waiting, and somewhere among them, something was counting on a response that it never truly believed would come.